Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Mark Plattner, Vice President of Religion Studies here at the National Endowment for Democracy and editor of our Journal of Democracy. And on behalf of the National Forum for Democratic Studies, I'm very pleased to welcome you to today's session entitled How the Military is Eroding Democratic Institutions in Latin America, featuring Reagan Democracy Fellow Rut Diamint. Also delighted to have with us as a discussant Harold Trikunas of the Brookings Institution. It's important to recall that Latin America, the last quarter of the 20th century, not just with very few democracies, but with most of its countries under military rule. All that has changed. The longevity of the latest round of democratization in the region is unprecedented, and the absence of any military regimes in the hemisphere is remarkable. But despite this encouraging trajectory, civilian control over the security sector remains incomplete, leaving these countries potentially vulnerable to a reversal of gains. The military continues to enjoy considerable autonomy and exerts influence in areas unrelated to external defense. In her presentation, Rut Diamint will explore the new challenges posed by the military's role in partisan politics, in domestic law enforcement, and in wielding national power in both the domestic and international arenas with insufficient oversight, and the implications of these trends for democracy. Rut Diamint is professor of political science at Torquato di Tella University in Buenos Aires, and a researcher at Argentina's National Council of Scientific and Technological Research. An expert on civil-military relations, she served as chief of cabinet and advisor to the Argentine Ministry of Defense in 2004-2005. She's been a visiting fellow at Columbia University and has held a whole string of fellowships from the Fulbright Program, the Woodrow Wilson Center, the Tinker Foundation, and many others. She's been a consultant for Costa Rica's Arias Foundation, the Inter-American Development Bank, and the Washington Office on Latin America, and she's coordinated projects for the Ford Foundation and the Open Society Foundations on defense issues, political leadership, and democracy. She also, I learned, was appointed to serve on the UN Secretary General's Advisory Board on Disarmament. Is that something you're still doing?
Yes.
Okay. She's the author or editor of a number of books in Spanish, including Democracy and Security in Latin America, and her co-edited volume, Democratizing Politicians, a Study of Latin American Leaders, which was published in 2013 in Spanish, will be published in English translation later this year. And as editor of the Journal of Democracy, I'm pleased to note that in 1998, she co-authored an article with Consuelo Cruz entitled The New Military Autonomy in Latin America. During her fellowship, Rut has been studying the defense policies of key Latin American countries during the past decade, and she's planning to write a book on the changing role of the military in Latin America and the impact of regional defense policy on the global security agenda. Harold Trikunas is the Charles W. Robinson Chair and Senior Fellow and Director of the Latin American Initiative in the Foreign Policy Program at the Brookings Institution. His research focuses on Latin American politics, particularly related to foreign policy, governance, and security. He's currently studying Brazil's emergence as a major power, as well as Latin America's contributions to global governance, issues as energy policy, drug policy reform, and internet governance. He grew up in Venezuela, a country he still tells me he follows closely, and he previously served as an associate professor and chair of the Department of National Security Affairs at the Graduate School in Monterey, California. His many publications include, I'm happy to say, also a JOD article published in 2011, co-authored with David Pion Berlin, entitled Latin America's growing security gap. We'll now turn the floor over to Rut, who will speak for about 25 minutes, followed by comments from Harold for about 10 minutes. Those of you on Twitter can follow the presentation and contribute to the conversation by using the hashtag NEDEvents or by following the forum at Think Democracy and the endowment at NEDemocracy. If you've not already done so, please take a moment to join me in silencing your cell phones. And finally, let me take this opportunity to thank the many staff members involved with planning this event, and most especially Research Associate Heiner Sibrian, who's right here, who's offered vital assistance to Rut's fellowship project and to today's presentation. Thank you. It's all yours, Rut. I think we need to go down so the PowerPoint will work.
Well, I want to start saying that I want to thank National Endowment for Democracy for the opportunity to be here to have a research. I also want to thank all the staff of NED, but especially the staff of the fellow that really was very helpful to help me developing this idea and this work. And I also want to thank to the other fellows that are here that are really strong support for being here, understand what are the rules of the game. I need to have this. Well, this is the outline of the presentation. And I will start saying something that give me the idea that maybe my work is not wrong. When a friend of mine had the invitation for this presentation, he wrote me an email. He's not here. He wrote me an email saying that I am still working in civil-military relations, saying, well, you never finish. And I understand that that was really the point that I want to present today, that this is not a subject that finished for me. What I thinking to discuss today is since democratization, there has been a wide consensus, scholars, politicians, citizens, that democracy cannot be consolidated unless the armed forces are firmly under control of constituted civilian authorities. We, as Mark said, we can accept that very worthy terms through the region, but still not so strong that it could not surpass some forms of authoritarian government or autocratic government. Democracy has progress, but also has reversals. The second point is to rethink the concepts and tools for analyzing Latin American politics that, in some cases, do not match the traditional categories that are, in general, American categories. And third, if I can, I want to anticipate what regional effects can have this form of that I am trying to explain a little later, what could be the impact that the forms could have on the progress of Latin American democracy, but also for regional integration. The community shares the idea that control over the armed forces is a permanent process. It is always will be necessary to limit the role, to fix the missions, to analyze the budget, to control the prerogatives. And we must recognize that the conceptual work about civil-military relations has, in general, less attention than needed. The book is all the further discussion about the subject. The first for Alfred Stepan, David Puyon-Berlin, Felipe Agüero, Richard Cohn, Narcís Serra, Sam Fitch, Wendy Hunter, Harold Trikunas, among others, were very valuable contributions to try to explain the military question in Latin America. Propose a model with some similar attributes, but what we see now, what is that I want to explain today, is that these models are forms of military power. Yes. And I will work in these three different ideas. While some could argue that the last crises in Latin America were not a traditional coup d'etat, and the Honduras and Paraguay situation, still with military participation, seems more a palace coup and not a coup d'etat, it is not enough to claim that democracy is the only town. The lack of military intervention in moments of social revolts do not mean automatically the end of military leaderships. And it appears to be some novelties. The armed forces understood that there are not room for traditional coups, or that the costs for this kind of interventions are painfully high to risk such adventure. Anyway, the military has still power and can influence political decisions. I will differentiate three ways of gathering power. And I will use the three words that all the people in NED try to change because it's Spanglish. But as I speak in Spanglish, I still will use these categories until I find something better. The first is the partization of the military. And as some could suggest, it's not new. I want to say that it's not exactly as you said in the past, politicization of the military. That was translated in general as knock the doors of the barracks. This process that was very well described by Alain Rouquier led to the alliance between politicians and the military that longer in general develops in the autonomy of the officers. I would like to show in a little moment that there are now some peculiarities. The second is the politicization of the military, which also is not new. At least it is something new in the last 30 years, but now it has dramatically deepened the dependence of the civilian authorities in the use of the military force for domestic insecurity. And the third one category is what I temporarily call compartmentalization of power within the military. This is the best ground for oversight of the armed forces. The traditional categories of academia could match in this type, but something happened that after so many years of democracy, control is still incomplete. Well, I will start with the first category. Now, that is participation of the military. Left populist governments use the military as a political party. They organize the power under the friend or foe logic, and the armed forces have become for government policies, making them part of government. They recover a sentiment of dignity, being the defenders of the country against the imperialist desire of the Western powers. And I will give you an example, quoting President Evo Morales. I quote, "The empire used the country for several years to plunder natural resources, but now Bolivia is liberated economically and militarily. The country regained its dignity, and US groups have no right to subjugate the Bolivian armed forces." Close the quote. The executive negotiates political support by giving the armed forces autonomy, money, and power. In exchange, they ask for loyalty. It seems similar to the loyalty of the military to Communist Party in Cold War times, but it's a difference. There is not a strong political party. The military became the political party. This relationship puts under scrutiny the concept of subjective control developed by Huntington. There are not subjective control. There is privileged relationship between the chief of the state and the Praetorian Guard. This is cooptation, seduction, extortion, and complicity, but not real control. This category is difficult to put under the traditional civilian control theories. It's the best of the worlds. The military does not need a coup d'etat. They have the power by the president. They have the legitimacy coming from the hand of a legally elected authority. Let me to give another example. President Maduro lives between a residence inside Caracas military base, Fort Triuna, and the barrack of the mountain close to the Chavez tomb. President Maduro, a civilian with no military background, has with military officers to a greater extent than Chavez. Major General Gustavo Enrique González López, after knowing that he was included in the list of 7 civilian servants recently sanctioned by the U.S. government, was designated Secretary of Interior, Justice, and Peace in March 10 of this year. Was the choice of the president or was a demand of the armed forces? Also, the military obtained important material benefits. President Rafael Correa from Ecuador intended to reduce the economic power of the armed forces. And now, the constitutional reform, it was stated that the military only can have enterprises related to defense production. From 33 companies that the Dirección de Industrias del Ejército, Dirección de Industries of the Army, had in the past reduced to 31. DINE, the direction, has other steel industries, the Marriott, Quito Hotel, textile industries, flour, shrimp factories, banana, small truck, etc. In this case, the military has a political power and economic power, and it is clear that they can put restriction on president decisions. Military companies in Nicaragua are under the Institute of Social Military Prevention. The holding will take part in the new venture of the canal. Military affinity for Ortega helped to obtain some benefits from Nicaragua retired Colonel Carlos Barnes, said the army worked in the stock exchanges, construction, hospital, cement, hardware, bank, and universities. In Nicaragua, the armed forces not only have economic power, but they democracy increasing corruption. I would like to express the significance of this with an old friend of Richard Cohn, also in the Journal of Democracy. Excluding, in part, a Nicaragua, I use the expression, this military do not descend from the grandma, to illustrate a superficial degree of revolutionary socialization of Venezuela, Bolivian, or Ecuador officers. For the people who is young and don't know probably the grandma is the yacht used by Fidel Castro and 82 soldiers to make the Cuban Revolution coming from Mexico in 1956 to overthrow the regime. The Cuban armed forces were created by the revolution, totally different from the other 3 countries that I named before. Government is eternal, but the officer won't lose quietly all the privilege and the material acquired in these years. This is attention for the future of democracy. What happened? Yes. Yes. Well, the second subject is politicization of the military. Latin American experts have written extensively about the problem of using the military as a police. Several authors also signaled the domestic role of armed forces, especially related to drug trafficking, increasing the possibility of corruption. Lack of institutional capacity and severe security threats drive civilian institutions to turn to the military to safeguard the political system as a whole, which forces them to renegotiate the terms of civil-military relations. There are the rule of law, which is not the objective of armed forces. This allows for distinct levels of repression and militarization. For example, the Center for International Policy notes that each Saturday, 25,000 Honduran kids receive a training from troops and military installations, a militarized park and plaza, the Guardian of Homeland program. Added a comment from Victor Mesa, former Minister of Interior and expert on security. This militarization is the biggest threat to the we have lived. I finished the quote. At the worst, there are not one case in which the use of the armed forces solved the insecurity problem. In general, the use of the military as a police is decided as an exception, and for a limited time, and in reality, this never happened. Mexican President Calderon deployed tens of thousands of military personnel to supplement and in many cases replace the local police force. Calderon's military offensive did little to diminish the cartel's presence. According to the National Human Rights Commission, the participation of the Mexican Army in public security task gives sad records in the context of the military-dominated counter-drug operation related to violations, human rights violations, and including the death of civilians, without mentioning creation of local self-forces in some regions that poses a threat to state sovereignty. Moreover, domestic role encouraged the military to negotiate politically. They habituate them to have power to bargain. The sense of impunity spread and the rule of law is weakened. In Brazil last March, large demonstrations dominated by the middle and upper classes demand for impeach Dilma, associated to corruption, but also there were some calls for military intervention. According to Article 144 of the Brazilian Federal Constitution, domestic security police is a private function of the federal police, federal traffic police, federal rail police, civil police, military police, and military fire brigades. In the category that we are analyzing, it is possible to speak about socio-military relations. Society is demanding for more security coming from the military as a subject, and second, society is the object when they are victims of repression. Since the government does not have a proper organization to combat crime, they ask a favor to the armed forces, and in politics, this favor must be paid. Government became, in a way, hostage of the armed forces. The outcome is control, and the authorities don't have total freedom of decision. Regular civilian control does not have room in this kind of relationships. And I go now to the last one, compartmentalization of power. Civilian governments negotiate transition of power from the military, allowing that they retain some prerogative from greater extent. Autonomous budget allocation and organizational and functional management still rest on the head of the officers. In some cases, they act as agents of a modernization and technological process. Probably the case is Brazil nuclear policy, to try to give an example of this. As a legal actor, the Brazilian government takes advantage of the NTP absent regulation about the production, use, and disposition of highly enriched uranium for naval nuclear reactors. This generates bad example. The Arms Control Association reported, and I quote, Iran's Deputy Navy Commander Abbas Amini was quoted in June 2012 as saying that preliminary steps in making an Iranian atomic submarine have started. And the article declares, and I quote again, the case of Brazil demonstrates how non-nuclear weapon states could use naval nuclear reactor fuel as a justification for unmonitored accumulation of fissile material. Besides, the Brazilian army intelligently convinced their authorities of the medium-term risk of hostilities related to natural resources. And the less intelligent armies of Argentina, Paraguay, Uruguay, and Venezuela have accepted this fantasy, them a role. Yes. Chile has acquired in between 2003 and 2012 more armaments in absolute terms than any other country of Latin America. In spite of the intention of civilian government, it was very costly to reform the law of the Ministry of Defense of Chile due to contestation power of the military and its allies. Argentina in the recent years is assimilating defense with development and reconstructing part of the military complex previously closed in the Menem administration. Lately, it also opened domestic intelligence capacities to the army, something that is forbidden by law, but could give support on the Cristina presidency. Although Argentina had developed the best model of civilian control over the military, the lack of institutionalization of this measure produced setback and dilution. In this category, it is possible to improve the model of civil-military relation, traditionally speaking. There are regulations and norms, and most important, there are institutions to mediate. But, as I said in the beginning of my presentation, the political authorities do not consider important and rational to improve the. My question, and this is a work in progress, and I am trying to improve it with your participation, is how can we analyze the situation when there are actors that do not follow the rule of the games? Or how we can develop some conceptual tools that can interpret in a better way the current situation of civil-military relations in America. And I can accept that maybe I need to change the title, and it must be how the civilians are eroding democratic institutions in Latin America. Thank you.
Thank you for a very interesting presentation, Rut, and for adhering strictly to the time limit. And now we'll hear some comments from Harold Trikunas.
Great. Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this panel. It's a great pleasure to see my friend Rut again, as well as to see you again too, Mark. I very much appreciate being part of the conversation here on this issue, which I spent so many years studying, especially in my previous career as a university professor. So, and in fact, Rut, with her last line of her presentation, sort of her premise of my comments, which was to, in fact, suggest that we might think about the causality that the title implies, and raise a question, which I think Rut did at the end: to what extent are militaries eroding democracy in Latin America, and to what extent are civilians, through their use, misuse, or non-use of militaries in different instances, in fact, contributing to erosion of democratic institutions in some cases. So if I would to rephrase the title of the talk, it would be how civilian presidents are using militaries to erode democratic institutions in some countries, sometimes ways. But I don't think that'd be snappy enough, really, I don't really see that grabbing attention in Washington when you send the email out to announce the event. So I do want to say that I think that Rut is, very much work I've followed for a very long time, is as usual exactly the right categories and pointing at some very important phenomena when it comes to thinking about what are the issues where we say the new forms of use of militaries and what are the implications for power within the state and for democracy. Issues of the use of the military to support particular partisan agendas, use of the military on a routine basis to fulfill internal security or police functions, lack of oversight of certain areas of military activity still after 20, 25, 30 years. My apologies, I'm recovering from a bit of a cold. And also really point to the fact that we're no longer thinking about military coups as the problem. We're really thinking now about how the military is used and how the military behaves within democracies. And so I think we really have three problems to consider as we think about this issue of causality. Who's doing what? To what extent is it the military? And to what extent are these civilians within democracies in connection to militaries achieving these effects that Rut points to? And I think, so I would point to three things. One is there's a general phenomenon in the region that my colleague David Pine-Berlin and I talked about in an article a few years ago about insufficient civilian attention to defense and security issues. A second issue is, as Rut very well points out, civilian presidents actively using militaries to advance partisan goals. And the third thing that I think we need to think about is the behavior seeking enhanced role, prestige, budgets through their operations within bureaucratic politics within the state. And of these three phenomena, really would point to the civilian presidents using militaries to advance partisan goals, I think is really the center of the problem that Rut is pointing to, and is the thing that is probably newest and most threatening. Because I think if we look back over the whole range of studies that we've done for the past 30 years, since democratization, the issue of civilian inattention to defense and security issues has been a constant. And I'll talk about why the issue of military bureaucratic politics and seeking a larger role and a larger share of the budget within states has relatively been a constant over the period. But the use of the military by civilian presidents to advance partisan goals is really what's newest about the last 10 or 15 years. So let me take each of these in turn. Civilian inattention to defense and security issues. In a sense, this is logical. I mean, within the region, this is a region that by and large is demilitarized. It's a region that has not seen military conflict, interstate military conflict for almost 2 decades now. It's a region that's not militarily threatened from other parts of the world. The kinds of classic defense threat motivations that would lead civilians to pay attention to militaries simply do not exist in the region. I think this reduction of militarization across the region since the end of the 70s has driven some of this inattention. The second thing is obviously inherited from the previous military period, civilian mistrust of militaries that leads them to downgrade the role of basically shy away from dealing directly with militaries on a regular basis, and this affects everything from politics within states, even down to issues of what career paths do people choose within government administration, how many people associate themselves as civilians with the study of defense and security in Latin America. And so this has been an issue for a long time. I remember talking to Rut about it over the years. But also the fact that in many countries, paying attention to defense and security issues has not traditionally been something that produces electoral advantage. So the result is the military tends to be used in a either ignored or used on an ad hoc basis in many cases throughout the region. Do you have a napkin by any chance? So I would point to civilian being one of the reasons why the military is able to have the degree of impact and influence that you point to, Rut, and I think is especially important, thank you, in relation to the issue of policing, because I think, as you rightly point out, governments basically are facing emergency situations in many cases, reach the military as a way of solving this problem as a short-term solution, because really the solution to many of these security issues passes through police reform, judicial reform, penitentiary or penal reform, and those are long-term processes. So this inattention to the military, except for crisis situations, when you reach for the military to solve a security situation, very much goes to this issue of politicization. It's hard to say even in Spanish, of civil military relations. So turning now to the second issue of the civilian presidents directing militaries towards partisan ends. I by and large agree with Rut that I think this is a very important problem. I would put a little bit more weight, maybe than you have, on the role of the civilian executive in playing a leading role in doing this. I don't think that they're necessarily allowing or bargaining into power. I actually think people like Chavez and Rafael Correa and Evo Morales are quite deliberate about the way they use the military in politics. So I just raise a question mark, or maybe we look for more evidence about the influence actually goes, because I very much see it as part of them achieving their dominance in local. And so I agree with you. We're not seeing a traditional Cold War party military fusion, of the kind of traditional communist state style, but it is sort of this way that you use the military to enhance your own power and to diminish the power of other institutions. So one thing I would point to as a question mark for your project going forward is to what extent, in a certain sense, some of the predictions we've seen in the past where we thought that the military being involved in domestic politics would lead to their more problematic politics or maybe a return of the military to politics through coups and things like that has not really happened. And is that because civilian executives today in the countries that you mentioned, like Venezuela or Nicaragua or Ecuador, are simply better at managing relations with the military? Or is this just an effect of the commodity and cheap credit super cycle, which has made it much easier to solve social problems in the region, paper over differences, and therefore now as we're coming to an end of that cycle, will now sort of, is this the time when we'll start seeing these problems emerge? So I think that that's an issue that we're going to have to keep an eye on going forward. What is going to be the actual impact on democracy? Is it consolidating presidential authority, or is it, in fact, we're going to be of military participation in politics? And the third and sort of least problematic, but not unproblematic issue is a whole military role and budget expansion within democracies that's happened over the past 10 or 20 years as a result of the internal security role, as a result of military seeking to justify their existence. Mentioned that one that you might want to look at when you look at issues of military spending, I noticed you use is that in general, military spending in Latin America very consistently across time tends to rise and fall with changes in GDP. And so that I think you'd have to differentiate between the normal increase in military spending that's simply associated with the fact that Latin America has gone through a decade of above average growth, and what is actually a product of sort of military influence. And that a more finer grained look at, which I know you'll do. And so finally, let me just close with this, Mark. How am I doing on time? Yeah, okay. Is sort of what can be done about this, or what can Latin America do about this, and what can the international community do in support of Latin American democracies? I think that ultimately, a lot of what we're seeing is an effect of this issue of, as much as your friend said at the beginning of your talk, focus on this. I think that this is a general phenomenon in the region, that people sort of lost interest in the problem of the military and politics once the threat of coups receded, and they've sort of tended to not pay attention for the reasons I talked about. But ultimately, building civilian control of the military does require, as you know, that are knowledgeable, that are engaged, and that have the level of political support they need to conduct reform. And so that's one part of the problem, which is the traditional puzzle we've always known about for the last 20, 30 years. How do you get civilians engaged in this process? And the ones that are engaged, how do you get what they need to achieve what they need to do? But the other thing is, how do you get the rest of civilian society and civilian institutions engaged? Because the other part of this is checking civilian presidential excesses. It's in a Congresses and judiciaries and civil societies doing to call presidents on the carpet when they use the military as a way to expand their authority vis-a-vis other actors within the democratic. And in a certain sense, hopefully one lesson that Latin American democratizers or small d Democrats would draw from the past 10 or 15 years is the need to check presidential excesses early and often. That presidential's claims for needing unusual levels of power above and beyond what the Constitution would normally allow is something that should be treated with great suspicion. And finally, from the point of view of the international community, I really think that it's we've shown, in a sense, the limits of what, and having come from a background in this, I mean, it sort of pains me to say this, but the limit of what education and security cooperation can do. I mean, let's face it, the international community and Latin American governments and Latin American militaries have been talking about issues related to civil military relations for 25 or 30 years. And I've the other during most of my career. But I think those issues, are understood by the narrow range of people who actually engage on them. And so what needs is sort of the broader work of, on the one hand, coming up with solutions to the problems Latin America has that leads them to reach for the military to solve issues which are not really used for the military, particularly in internal security. This means coming up with workable approaches to police reform, judicial reform, legal reform, penal reform, the policy, for example, on drug policy, which has led to mass incarceration of people. I mean, you could go on, but there's a whole cluster of problems around internal security and domestic security, citizen security, that really need to be solved, that helps governments not have to or feel tempted to reaching for the military as part of the solution, even if in emergency situations, as we've already seen, they often do. And the other area is support for that broader range of democratic institutions in a region that's already so hyper-presidential in many ways. In a sense, I almost feel like we haven't done enough with those other branches of government. How do they engage in helping to limit the actions of presidents when presidents reach for militaries as convenient ways to support and advance their own partisan causes, which is what we see. It's just tempting to do so, and I think that there's another body of work to be done around there. So it's almost that issue of civil-military relations, thanks to the work Rut and others have done in civil-military relations for the last 25 years. We understand that problem pretty well. It's that broader societal level of civilian that still needs our help and our work. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Harold. Let me, Rut, before I open it in general, and you may want to respond to some things Harold said, but let me pose to both of you to just be sure that I'm clear. And when you're discussing the civilian president's use of the military for partisan goals, which I think it is what your term partidization means as well. Is that a phenomenon that you see primarily in the ALBA countries, or does it affect the region more broadly? I wasn't really sure in both your cases.
Well, I began to answer this, and after also making a comment in what Harold told to me. And the reality is this began with the ALBA countries, but Argentina President Cristina Fernández de Kirchner wants to do the same. And I think that is not related to the ALBA countries, but is related to the populist countries that have a special logic to seduce the citizens with some kind of policies that have good results, but in the medium and large term, very bad results. The moment that the president tried to do that was a moment in where she was losing power, she was losing followers, and we are lucky that this has a way that happened in Venezuela or Bolivia. But I think that also have some relation with the lack or the weakness of institutions. And I need to recognize that in one sense, Argentina, with all the problems, have strong institutions, have counterbalance capacities. And well, probably I leave now Harold to answer, and after I have some comment in your comment.
No, thank you. I mean, I think I agree with Rut. And it's particularly our last comment about the role of strong institutions, because in a certain sense, the reason is that, by and large in the region, if you look, there are procedures, there's laws, there's constitutional norms that allow the use of the military in internal roles. I mean, there's very few countries that went as far as Argentina did in strictly limiting the role of the military internally. So it is very difficult to say that it is militaries, and in fact, you would not want this, that militaries should have to judge when they're getting a partisan order from the president, unless they're being ordered to do something specifically illegal, right? That's been ruled out by law or by international law, laws of war, et cetera, et cetera. It really should be the other institutions of government, the courts, the legislature, civil society, the press, that should be making that kind of judgment. That's really their place, and it's really, a fine line, because I think when there is that ambiguity, it's possible to see that factions within the military will align with the president for their own personal advantage, even though, by and large, many officers may not be interested in going down that path, but do not see a legal way to basically say no, right? A real issue that we just have to recognize.
Spreading.
I think it's by and large, I think Ruth is right that it's really associated with populism more than anything this decade. And if we think back to the 1990s, we saw a few instances like President Fujimori, more on the right, but again, still populist, of using sort of the military as part of generally using state power to build direct connections with people and respond to constituents and build their power. But I think that's by and large correct.
Well, first I want to thank your comments, and I need to think about some of them. I have one question about the paper that you wrote with Pion Berlin, Attention Deficits, that I do not share. I write about my critics to the article, but this is in Spanish, and in general, Spanish articles do not arrive to US. Probably you don't know.
I've read your...
Yes, you know very well. This is something that I don't take now because it's a little more longer, but I want to make a comment in the last comment that you made. The reality is, yes, we need a broader change, a broader improvement of the institution, also related to your question, political parties. Political parties, you don't need the military as a political party. But in the case that you don't have political parties because they were destroyed by mistakes made by the political class, you need something to replace your support. And it's interesting that in the case of Chavez, he tried to have a political party and was really not very successful. In the case of Correa, he don't want to have a political party, and he is not investing in a political party. And in the case of Evo Morales, the reality is he belongs to a political party, but in a way, he was not giving power to the political party that he belonged for so many years. And this is something that probably merits more research. I return to the Harold question, because it is true that military oversight is not the main problem now in Latin America. But I work in this subject. I don't work in the I work in this subject, and I am, as you know, we are few people who work in the subject, and we have a memory of the years that we live under dictatorships. And for me, it's not only an academic question. It's a position, it's a thing related to my life that I am afraid that in any moment the military can return. That is why, although I coincide with your, I agree with your comment about the other institutions that are really giving the military some activities, as the reconstruction of all, and also as the reconstruction of parties in this subject.
Okay, thank you for that comment. Now, why don't we throw it over to the audience? Why don't we take 2 or 3 questions?
Hi,
Identify yourself.
I'm Adam Isaacson from the Washington Office on Latin America, and thank you. That was terrific, Ruth and Harold. I guess my question, partidization can happen from the opposition also. Look at Colombian ex-president Uribe's Twitter account, where he's appealing to the military every day, calling the current president a traitor to the armed forces. And there seems to be an effort to try to do that. My question, though, is I don't think Uribe, when he does that, is trying to encourage a coup. To what extent do you think today, when politicians are appealing to the military, they're doing so out of the military's capacity for violence, or is it because the military is always atop the polls in terms of institutions that are seen as popular, they're symbols, and just about everybody in the country has a relative who's or knows somebody who's in the military, and therefore they want to be seen as having the military on their side for that reason, more than the threat of violence? Or do you think it's still a mix of the two?
Take a couple more.
Thank you, and Harold. I'm Johanna Mendelson Foreman, and friends with both of you, and I appreciate all your comments I just wanted to bring up a term that neither of you mentioned, Harold more so, and it's a thesis I have about what I've seen on the ground, and that is citizen security has become the new popular word that replaces what we called with civil military relations. And they two terms do not meet in terms of institutions. So you have people who are very deeply interested in citizen security and don't give a whiff about what happens with military police relationships because precisely those people didn't want to deal with military relations to begin with. And I think in terms of democratization, citizen security is essential. We know country we've looked at, it's a big Achilles heel even in countries where democracy, but nobody joins the terms or looks at them as a relationship. What that means in terms of practical implementation is that the institutions you need for citizen security, which are internal, or the police, are often sidelined military budgets you approve. So in adding to what you're looking at in terms of the resourcing, dismiss the division of resources that go to versus where citizen security really lies. And the reversion to the military to perform security functions is precisely this denial of other civilian institutions their share. So in terms of democratization, it's very debilitating. And I think you might want to look a little bit more deeply into how the pie is divided in the countries that you're looking at. Because I recently got back from Honduras, and I mean, that's the poster child for this division and yet offers some very good examples. It's not the only one, but I suggest that there is a need to look at that split because it's not a realistic one.
Thank you very much. Ruth, I would encourage you to think about your last your conclusion. Um, I think the examples you gave really focus on the issue of weak institutions of democracy, and I would argue perhaps a weak understanding of the function, the performance of democracy in those institutions. Every case you used as example, I think, fell into what Fareed Zakari would call illiberal democracies. You know, they hold elections, they aren't really functioning in the democratic way, and and that's particularly important in I think the point that making on who controls the police, because very often the police are organized, governed by the state or municipality, not the central government. So responsibility for that organization, and indeed that budget, goes much further down the chain. So it's, as one of my Mexican friends argued, in contradicting the criticism of use of the military, who else were we going to be able to use in an organized way? Granted, you know, they weren't trained to deal with internal urban policing and so forth, but the police was that bad. You didn't, I think, give examples, and I think it would help, of some of the good things that the militaries have done. For example, peace operations, Haiti, where they really were able to work together, countries together, work in stabilizing a country, and then maybe get out when the time comes. And almost every one of those forces would argue we got absolutely no thanks at home for the good effort that we made on the scene. So again, the question of and you used this example. I appreciate the concern over the period of military dictatorships. But I think the academic community in the region has not turned the page on that period and confronted the new challenges of democracy and what you can civilian responsibility and control. And I would argue that a case that you really should look at is Colombia, which has quite an effective civilian-controlled Ministry of Defense, civilian staff, et cetera, in spite of the fact that it over many years an ongoing internal conflict. So I think, to quote Shakespeare badly, the fault, dear Brutus, is not in our stars, but in ourselves that we are underlings. And we need to look at the civilian responsibilities and their performance in executing democracy, much more than criticize the military for being used by the Thanks.
Excuse me, I need some translation. And first with the Adam question, the government of Uribe was a populist government. In this sense, nothing changed to use the military as other populist governments. And the reality is, it's difficult to think that the opposition can use the military. Maybe in the case of Colombia, it's very peculiar because they are in a war in some sense. But you need the government to use the military because, for good or for bad, the military is a state institution. And it is true that in some countries also there are some perception about the military. If you take the case of Ecuador, I can't Ecuador the subject of civil-military relation because the people, the citizens, love the armed forces. The first institution recognized not only because they have they give work jobs to the people, but for them, the citizen really feel that is the axis of the country. That all. And if I was 1 month teaching in Ecuador, and the people from the ministry that were my students, and the people from the military that also participate, they really don't want to discuss the subject of civil-military relation because have no or the way of as the military works inside the state. And the people in general trust more in this sub-state than in the political authorities. And the things of prestige, and the reality is also in Peru, you have something similar. The military have prestige, and the society, some part remember the old times, etc. And I will return to this after when I answer something from the Margaret. Was some military dictatorship, but the reality is for the people, for most of the people, the military are subjects of modernizations, are honored, are not corrupt. With the drug trafficking was corruption, but not all the people were thinking, as probably I think in Argentina, that the subject is a little different from other countries. And also Brazil can be another example where there are clear compatibilization. This English? No. Compatibilización. Compartir. The share a common vision between the Itamaraty and the army and the navy, they have common interest, and society is in a way proud about the capacities or the possibilities that the armed forces can do to develop the country and to the progress of the country. It's not a subject that can have the same weight for all the world, all the Latin American countries. I go now from the really the subject what group who is controlling the police, but the relation between the police and the military, because I also have an experience in Honduras, and I remember that was a person, a civilian, was killed, and there was passing the culpability between the army and the police. Clear who was the person who killed this civilian, and no one was responsible. They were taking your problem. Well, in a way, also because I think that this changed because my work in Honduras was several years ago, but in the time that I was there, you have a police in the street with 3 months of preparations. And the military, who has 1 year of preparation, thinks that the police really have lower value. They really have some disdain from the police. But in a lot of situations, they need to work together. And well, this creates a lot of problems, and I think that's a very good suggestion to put a little more attention in the subject. And with Margaret, in a way, I use the last title that saying the civilians have also responsibility for using the military. But the military they are very open to collaborate. They are never saying, well, no, my task under the Constitution and under the law must be that and that. They accept very easily. And in a way, they're deepening this illiberal democracy because they accept to, in a way, go against the rule of law, go against the division of power. And I have a last point related to the peace operation that, yes, I agree, it's a good activity that the military are performing, but the reality is the only thing that I am interested to analyze from this subject in this context, in the context of my research, is how difficult it is organize some activity together between the armed forces of the region, because each country has a very different idea and role for the armed forces, and how difficult will be also to translate these differences to UNASUR and the Defense Council of UNASUR, because they have very different meanings around the region. There are an article, I don't know if you read the article of Otaglino that appeared 1 month ago, and he says something, I don't agree with his paper, but it's a very good paper, an excellent paper, and he said, well, all these new tasks of the military in reality generates a more stable democracy. He, who is also a person who is very close to the government in Argentina, he has a totally different perception of me, of my perception, saying the role that the military are performing gives more stability to the democracies in Latin America. This is probably a problem also of age, of a political orientation, but we can turn the page because the situation was not solved. I am still waiting for the judge, the juicios judge. And maybe because I believe in what was the base of the renewal of democracy with Alfonsín, I believe that the solution comes after the justice say who was guilty and who was not. And probably after that, I can turn the page, not before that.
Sure. Before I answer the question, I just wanted, one of the things that Ruth said in her comments after mine was, please don't misinterpret me as saying that you should work on all these other issues. I'm just suggesting that the problem you're trying to address really needs to be set within this broader frame of institutional weakness, lack of parties, which I thought was very, which goes to exactly this issue about when should the military be the one to be saying no? And in that case, are they deliberating or not? And when should other people be helping to say no to the president? No, really, that's a bad idea to use the military for these things. Because I think to have that context of setting the boundaries of what are the acceptable ways to use militaries to support civilian administrations in the region. But then coming back to, I think was a very interesting one. And I think, this issue of appealing to the military, not as you say, Adam, in pursuit of a coup, but in a way of trying to use that popularity or accumulated prestige the military has in Colombia to support a particular position, it is a reflection, I think, of some of these more populist tendencies, I think, that you saw under the Uribe administration. Of the particular Colombian case was Colombia is a little bit unusual in the sense of because of the internal war, because of the high prominence given to the military during the Uribe administration and even the Santos administration in solving this, the large growth of the armed forces, so as you say, almost everybody has a relative or knows somebody who's in the military. Those are all really quite unusual by Latin American standards at this point. And so maybe Colombia might be a little bit of an outlier in the way the opposition appeals to the military. But it just goes to show that it is a resource there to be used. And certainly if you look at how Chavez used appeals to the military and the military's image, because the military is seen as very popular in Venezuela, you see that phenomenon. Ruth pointed this in the case of Ecuador as well. So it's certainly there. The military's prestige is a resource to be utilized. I think in Colombia, because of both the size of the military and the opposition's particular connection to the military, it's a resource available to the opposition. So I point to that. Just quickly on Joanna's point, the whole focus on citizen security as opposed to civil-military relations, I think, you're basically right that the things are definitely not equal, as you point out. And this whole focus on citizen security is really a reflection of the fact that there's unsolved problems in the security that are really not properly the military's, but just in the rush to get citizen security, you're sort of doing things, you're taking shortcuts. And it's really a call for the fact that, and this is something I've really been thinking more and more the last couple of years, is, there's really some very serious work that needs to be done on that particular front of how do you solve that in domestic security, human security situation in many of these countries, especially Central American Caribbean Basin, so that you don't have that excuse of shortcutting to the military, which the military, I think you're right, is many people in the military are open to that. Not all, but there's always a faction that can benefit and align itself, in a sense, work towards the president's goals as a way of benefiting their own careers, getting their services more resources, all these things that phenomena that we've observed. So the military is not, I slightly disagree with Margaret. The military is accepting what the civilians are doing. There's also self-interested military officers who work towards the goals laid out by a populist president because it provides career advantage, personal advantage, service advantage. So you see kind of a combination. It might not be an institutional policy, but ambitious officers can see where the president is pointing and work in that direction to advance their careers. That's, I think, true in many, many places, not just in Latin America.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you very much for the presentations. Both were very, very good. I have a question. Maybe one of the paradoxes of Latin America is what you said at the beginning. Latin America is basically a no-war zone, and that may. I wonder to what extent, or what's your view in regards to this? To what extent that explains the fact that the military in Latin America are so involved in non-military issues, or it's an issue for Latin America to define the role of the military?
Hi. Sorry. Hi, my name is Karina Solmirano. I work at the IDB on citizen security issues, and I used to work at CIPRI on military expenditure issues, so I kind of combine the two fields. And it's just an observation, actually, because I think that the issue that Joanna brought is really interesting, not only in terms of who controls the police, but this whole relationship about resources. As far as I know, in terms of military expenditure, in terms of GDP, the military in Latin America doesn't, spend that much money. But over the last decade, you could say that the growth of military expenditure has at least some relation Mexico and Central America with tasks that are related to citizen security. When you look into the budgets, Ministries of Defense of Guatemala or Mexico, Honduras, you find certain programs that are basically citizen security related for the acquisition of police vehicles or for training the police. So the military is also doing a sort of a mission that has nothing to do with their original mission of defending the nation, but also providing that training to the police and that equipment. And I think there is a venue of research that would be really interesting for you, Ruth, because it has to do with the whole accountability and oversight of this particular field of the military forces, which, as far as I know, no one is looking at now.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Erica Hernandez from The World. So I remember reading a little bit of Barbara Geddes' typology, as well as O'Donnell's and Schmieder's Green Book, saying that the military, it was their best interest cohesive and remain institutionalized, that is not being that much involved or politicized. Now this might not be true, but to what extent does that hold right now? Of our current cases, for instance, in Mexico and Venezuela or Bolivia and so forth.
Sure. No, let me just start with this last question and work my way back. I think this issue you raised is something I was trying to point to in a very brief comment, where I basically pointed out that what was made in the civil military relations literature was that domestic roles for the military, domestic role expansion, would be problematic because it would lead to politicization. This is sort of drawing on the internal security experience of the dictatorship in the past. And even though we can see problems for the democracies in terms of role expansion as out, really threatened the in power in a couple rare instances, but mostly it's been unproblematic. And the question is why? Is the prediction wrong? Or what else is going on? And so this is one of the things I think, I don't know what the answer is, but I think that there is an issue associated with the fact that this role expansion and the things we're pointing to happened during a time where there was a commodity boom and there was easy credit available to many Latin American governments, which means that very few countries had to make hard choices about how to spend their resources. And now that's ending. In a number of the countries that we're most concerned about, it's ending especially quickly. And so I think that this is kind of the phenomenon that we'll have to look at in the next 3 to 4 to 5 years, what happens on that front. Then on the issue of citizen security, the role of the military participating in some of these programs in Mexico and Central America, I do think that you're right to point to that as a question, as a defense spending or security spending has risen more quickly than just GDP growth would predict, that it really is related to particular areas of tasks or role expansion. And the particular connection of militaries to police, I think you were pointing to that route too, like for example, Honduras, is really problematic. I mean, in a certain sense, is what is the military transmitting to police when they're participating in the training? We've even seen some direct examples of that in the creation of some of the Central American National Police. But then the question is, who else can sort of assistance training? I mean, frankly, I have to say, looking at the role of the United States over the past 10 or 20 years, we're just not very good at helping other people reform their police. Honestly, hear from Carsey, who would tell me wrong and give me all kinds of reasons why I'm wrong. But frankly, I mean, having done security cooperation for 15 years, I think it's just not, we're not that good at the police side of things. And it's really something that needs a lot more work. And let me stop there and maybe, you know.
Well, first, with Miriam question, can be as el huevo y la gallina and the chicken, who was first if the military, because they are not war, began to be involved in politics, or was because they were in politics that they don't have time for war. But you know, in reality, I don't think, I really have no data to confirm this, my appreciation. But the participation in politics is totally related, maybe it's in a part, but totally related to the absence of war. I think that is more in the way that the countries related to the Spanish tradition were developed, where the military, in several cases, was not real military. The people who make the independence war and the people who make the conquer of the West, in the sense of expanding the territory, was in general not military but career. The career of the military begins in the late 19th century. And in this moment, before having a formal professional career, the military had a lot of power, and they was participating in a very direct form in politics. I think that I don't know exactly, but in a way, it's a relation of new countries, weak society, a very classist form of organizing the country that I think that we heard people, control of the politics, all the things make that the military that became in the first moment part of the high class. In some countries that not follow the rule, but in some countries as Argentina, Chile, Peru in some way, the military were part of the high class. And I think that it was another form of expand the power of the very close groups who controlled the countries. It's not something that I really was testing, and it's a supposition. Maybe I am wrong. With Karina, and I also answer with the Karina the last question of America, so I don't understand bad. In a way, I think that you're true. There are a growth of resources, police tasks that the military need to do. But in another way, if you read some declaration of Evo Morales, he's buying chips and planes and another material equipment. They have new threats. The new threats is related to the US, is related to natural resources, and also in a way, because it's not so expression, is related to the relation with Chile, although they know that they can fight with Chile. But if you also take some declaration from the government of Venezuela and the government of Peru, and some expression of the former, I don't know if he's not, Ali Rodriguez is not more in the UNASUR, no? No. Ali Rodriguez, no, he's the Colombian now, yes. Speaking about natural resources, now the region have new threats. Now we are in a more competitive world, and we need to equip our countries because we will have new kind of threats. In general, related to US or other imperialism, and also related to natural resources. Maybe for the case of Mexico and some Central American countries, the relation with the police has more weight. But for others, it's a subject of defending the nation. In terms of accountability, it's interesting that there are not, as I know, any, as you have here in the US, any NGO or university group that is taking accountability, or at least analyzing how the military expenditures are spent in Latin American countries. I only know one person that is Thomas Sheets, who works in the subject. Is the only one that I know in all Latin America, but they are not nothing related to accountability, to know how the people is spending, how the government is spending the money that is assigned to the defense sector. Well, and this is now we also is answering the last question.
Go ahead.
Oh, I think Miriam's point is very good. But we have to remember that also this kind of demilitarization of the region is actually relatively recent phenomenon. It's only really in the last 20 years that has the region really become free of war. And in fact, if you look historically, in fact, Cameron Theus has done some work on this. Rivalry was a very important thing for Latin American countries because it helped justify resource extraction, taxes, building up the state. So rivalry rather than war was important, but even that has gone away in the last 20 years. And I think very deliberately so. Some people have shown how democratization leads to deliberately trying to dismantle border conflicts, border rivalries, settle disputes. Increasingly, those disputes go to the International Court of The Hague and so on and so forth for International Court of Justice. So judicialization of disputes. So military. So you're right. Now I think is really this scenario where the prospect of war is low. So what are the ways of conceiving of the military's role? Is it peacekeeping? Is it shrinking the military? Is it citizen security? Is it? And so this question marks kind of leave this institution available in a certain way to civilian presidents to use as a way to support themselves. So I think that links back to your original point.
Time's just about up. I have one very short question for you. This graph, which was also in your presentation, it would be very smooth, except there's this enormous jump in 1990, and went way up and way down. Just puzzled as to why that is.
No, yes, in general, 1990 already still with Chile, that still was in the transition to, and Chile spent, because they have the law Cooper military government. Oh, excuse me. There was a military government in the middle of the night. This in a way, answered the Chile transition.
So no one discovered a brilliant way to bring down budgets in 1990.
Not still, because there was a very weak government in Chile.
Okay, and our time is just about up. If there's a pressing final question we can make it. All right, then thank you very much to both our speakers, Ruth, Marvel.